Hi guys, my name is Ebony Hogg and this is my weekly review on the topic of civil and military coordination. I've been focusing on question 3 throughout this piece on looking at the existing frameworks and mechanisms for humanitarian, civil and military coordination and whether these are sufficient to promote effective humanitarian action. Also looking at how the military and humanitarian actors can work together more effectively, with the example in this piece looking at Pakistan. So just to sort of begin with, when a disaster actually strikes, these two groups end up often coming into play. So you've often got the military, which is the first responders on the ground, obviously because it's one of the key roles of the military to protect its citizens and to respond when they are in need. So they're always going to be present. And then you've also got the affected communities, you've got local people trying to get involved as well. And then you've also got the emergency services. And then once the international community is called upon, then you're also going to have humanitarian actors in the mix as well. So learning how coordination between these two different groups can occur will definitely sort of increase the efficiency and prevent overlaps and things like that occurring on the ground in these field environments as well. Now, the key challenges that can occur in regard to these relationships comes back to what the existing humanitarian core principles are, because they can often be a little bit contradicting in terms of the way that relationship takes place. So I'll quickly touch on what those three are, and we can look at that in more detail later on. So the first one would be looking at neutrality. So any humanitarian group going into a disaster-affected area needs to be able to remain neutral. So the main way that this occurs is that they don't favour any particular side in a disaster, especially in terms of if there's already pre-existing conflicts or sort of tensions occurring there. So remaining neutral is absolutely foundational to being a humanitarian organisation. Second one is looking at a similar sort of concept, which is remaining impartial. And this basically means that they don't really look at sort of what's happening too much around them, and they go there for their own humanitarian mandate, and they deliver aid without discrimination. The last one, which really makes this relationship most difficult, is that humanitarian groups are tasked with remaining independent from political or military objectives. So this can obviously be quite challenging if you're planning on working in partnership with the military, because it can be quite difficult to say that you're independent and you're also working together for the same sort of common goals. So these are some of sort of the issues that arise. One of the key ways that these issues can arise is in examples like where you've got humanitarians being escorted by military, or whether they're protecting different convoys. So this can create issues because it takes away from them looking as though they're neutral and can change their image in the public eye as well. Now, the next thing that I'm going to be touching on is looking at the existing frameworks that are currently occurring within this space that are sort of dictating how this process is becoming underway. So the main one that I'll be looking at is so it's using the UNCMC of coordination. So that's one of the key organisations that works for creating a central dialogue between the interaction of civil and military actors in humanitarian emergencies that provide and protect necessary humanitarian principles in those cases, mainly aiming to avoid competition, minimising inconsistencies, and wherever appropriate, pursuing common goals. So the basic strategies range from cooperation to coexistence together on the same sort of field. Coordination is a shared responsibility facilitated by liaison and common training between the two different groups as well. So outlined in these documents, there's 5 sort of main objectives that you sort of hope to achieve by utilising the mentioned sort of outcomes of these documents. So the first one would be to establish a mechanism for information exchange and humanitarian action with military forces. Second one would be looking at establishing and sustaining dialogue. Third one, assisting in negotiations in critical areas of humanitarian and military interaction. And then the fourth one is supporting development and dissemination of context-specific guidance for the interaction of humanitarian communities within the military. And then the last one is monitoring activities of military forces and ensuring positive impact on humanitarian communities. So these are all sort of very important functions of working together in these sort of environments. Now, the last thing that I'll be looking at is obviously some case studies and how we can learn to do these coordinated efforts better. So I have been looking at the examples from Pakistan. Okay, so looking at those 2 examples, the 2005 earthquake that hit Pakistan is a really positive example of how this civil and military coordination between the two groups can create very sort of effective responses. The outcomes of these two groups working together and joining forces in this case utilize the Army's search and rescue training, their logistical support, also their expertise and material resources for infrastructure projects, use their trained manpower, and on occasions also the security of relief workers as well, which was discussed a little bit earlier. Looking on the other side of things, looking towards the 2010 floods, this was massively devastating for the country, left around 1/5 of the total nation submerged, and the response was quite disjointed between the two groups based on a disagreement on the ideologies on how to respond to the crisis. Case in point, more on the relief to recovery transition period, where the government openly rejected the use of sphere standards, which humanitarians promised to sort of work by in the field. Now, this obviously has direct conflicts to the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, where the end goal of actually delivering aid becomes compromised. This was another example of how this occurred was in the politics of the complex disaster on the ground, where the international media were quick to point out that charities aligned with militant groups were filling in these gaps, where the Pakistani authorities and the international humanitarian agencies were not responding adequately for those sort of reasons of disagreement earlier mentioned. This led to a general fear that if the charity wings of the military groups were distributing aid on a large scale, then support for these organisations and ideologies could also increase as well. Coming back to the decisions of the Pakistani government, when the disaster actually struck, the government had very heavy restrictions on the use of their airspace. And for this reason, the UN humanitarian air services were not actually able to deploy their civilian helicopter within that very risky sort of window of when people need emergency help on the ground to save lives. This became increasingly frustrating when the government was avoiding whole regions that were affected based on sort of political reasons. So one example of that was in Punjab, where there were lots of people who didn't receive the aid that they needed because the government was coordinating the response, which compromises the needs-based approach that all humanitarians sort of go by as well. Now, This, I suppose you could look at it in the way that these shortfalls did occur on both sides in this example. So the aid agencies on the ground were severely lacking funding at the time. So the Pakistani government was kind of looking towards them being like, well, you don't even have funding, you're not going to be effective here, sort of get out of the way while we do our thing. However, after a period of time, that funding actually did sort of come into play, and it created sort of like a second wave of responses, which saved a lot of lives on the side of preventing deaths from hunger through the World Food program and the prevention of the spread of disease through different early warning systems by World Health Organization. Now, I suppose just to summarize, looking at these two groups, so civil and military coordination, it's always going to happen. It's going to be a necessary relationship for coordinating an effective response on the ground, especially where you want national ownership over the coordination of how these countries are choosing to adapt and respond to these crises, and it will also promote disaster risk reduction strategies as well, if these countries can learn to respond effectively to these crises. So learning how to interact better between military and humanitarian groups is an essential part of adapting to the new sort of scenarios of the future and making sure that we're effectively saving lives. Thank you.